Hi, I'm Spiders, and with the addition of Gale's new legendary weapon, the Wraithclaw, I've decided to make an updated video on which Gale elemental weapon is the best. With the Wraithclaw especially, people have really mixed opinions on just how good it is compared to the other weapons, so let's get into it. Alright, so before I make my stance clear about how exactly I would rank each of the 3 weapons, I think it's important that I get some base information about each weapon out of the way. Now, a really obvious thing about the 3 weapons to compare are their stats. So first, really briefly, we'll go over that. Now first, the requirements. One thing I like to note is that the Wraithclaw and the Curved Blade of Winds is basically the same for its requirements, except with light and medium. Now what this basically means is that you can have 2 exactly the same builds, but just swap one with light and one with medium. Now since these weapon stats are basically exactly the same, except one is light and one is medium, you can basically go the same builds for each weapon, but just swap those 2 stats of course, and just use whichever weapon you prefer. So that is one really nice thing about these legendary weapons. Now besides those 2, we have the Heroblade of Wind, which of course has the most lax requirements here with only 75 wind, which is really nice, but of course that comes with some downsides, which we'll get into later. Now as for the base damage and scaling, it kind of depends on your build and what kind of stats you go into, so it's kind of hard to compare them, but something that I can say about all 3 of these weapons is that they definitely have pretty low damage compared to standard weapons, and that is one main weakness that all 3 of these weapons have. But of course, since these are elemental weapons, it does make sense that they would have less damage for their lower requirements and not having to invest into a weapon, outside of the 25 medium or light requirement of course, so less damage is to be expected. And same with the swing speed too, it's also kind of hard to quantify which is the best because of course Heroblade of Wind does more damage, Wraithclaw does less. So Wraithclaw would have the most swing speed and Heroblade of Wind would have the least. So we won't really go into too much detail on that end. But of course I will say in the meta right now, having higher swing speeds is really good. So that is definitely one nice thing about the Wraithclaw and the Curved Blade of Winds too actually, since it's quite a lot faster than a normal medium weapon. Now next we have the weight, and while all of them are the same, since the Wraithclaw is the higher swing speed weapon, you can kind of take advantage of that 5 weight more. So even though all 3 of these weapons have 5 weight, that 5 weight is definitely more helpful on the Wraithclaw compared to the other weapons because of that swing speed, so definitely keep that in mind. And next up is the range. Now of course the medium weapons are going to have more range than the light weapon, but I will say on Gale especially, having a lower range on the Wraithclaw is really bad for a couple reasons. The biggest reason of which I'd say is because you have to feint a lot on Gale. Now pretty much because you have to feint a lot, this means that your opponent will also have to roll a lot more, because your feint baits out their parry, which means that they'll have to roll a lot during the fight in order to use that as their defensive option. But the result of that is on Gale fights, both you and your opponent will be moving around a lot, so it's really hard to catch people on a weapon with 6 range, and that is a really big downside to the Wraithclaw compared to the other weapons here. So that is something I really want to point out here. That is a really big loss in the Wraithclaw. But moving on from that for now, we also have 10, which doesn't really make too much of a difference here since all these weapons have about the same. But the Curved Blade of Winds does have slightly more than the other 2 weapons, so that's something nice about it. And finally, the last stat we have here is chip. Now the Heroblade of Winds has 0% chip, so that doesn't matter, and the Curved Blade of Winds has 5% chip, which is pretty much inconsequential. Almost nothing's going to change because of this. But one aspect of the Wraithclaw that really goes above the rest is having 20% chip, which is actually a pretty noticeable amount, especially compared to the other weapons here. The 20% chip basically means that your opponent will have to be a lot more careful about when they block and not blocking your weapon too much. Because although 20% chip on a light weapon might not sound like a lot, I do think that'll add up a lot over the course of a fight, so that is something pretty noteworthy about this weapon I'd say. Now just some things I'd like to say about these stats now that we've listed them all out. It's really not clear exactly which weapon is the best just from this, and all of these weapons have their advantages and disadvantages over the other ones here. But there is one thing that we haven't talked about yet, which is the crits, which is a pretty important part of each weapon. Now starting with the Wraithclaw, I really think that these crits are not amazing right now and really not that good to be honest. Now this weapon has 2 crits, the first of which is a standing crit as you can see here when you're on the ground. Now in this clip you can really see that it does have some potential to get a lot of damage and go kind of crazy, but 99% of the time this is not going to hit and it's just going to be really ineffective and probably end up in you getting punished if your opponent's good at the game, which is a really bad thing about this crit, and what makes this crit really not good at all I'd say. But the air crit on the other hand, when you're in the air, is pretty decent. It's also a crit that does a ton of posture damage as well, making it almost always a guard break. Now while this crit does have a pretty small hitbox, it can be used in some combos pretty well, such as after Res and Wind as you can see in this clip, or other varying situations. But honestly, just trying to use this crit, it's really janky to use if you're not already in the air, because like, if you try and jump and use this crit, a lot of the time it'll just do the standing crit because of some weird like Roblox ping issues, from what I've heard, which makes using this crit kind of inconsistent at times, which is definitely annoying. But overall, not too bad of a crit. Not amazing either, but it's usable in some situations at least. And next up is the Curved Blade of Winds, which also has 2 crits. The Single Sword crit, in my opinion, is probably the best crit out of these 3 weapons, since it just applies a lot of pressure and also doesn't have too much end lag, so you can actually use it in some combos. It's definitely not something game-changing, but totally usable in my opinion. The 2 sword crit on the other hand is kind of worse in my opinion, A lot of the time you can just get hit through it, and it's also not super high pressure compared to the other crit from what I've seen, but it can be used for mobility, which is pretty nice as well. So in my opinion, the Curved Blade of Winds has the best crits out of these 3 weapons. And lastly with the Curved Blade of Winds, which has a single crit. Now just from my experience, this crit really sucks, since honestly it's just super slow, and after they remove its guard break effect, it's just not impactful enough. And it's really not a strong factor of this weapon. So yeah, that is definitely a weak one of this weapon. Now that we have all the information laid out, which of these weapons is the best? Now I could give the generic answer like it depends, which of course is not wrong. It does depend on your preferences and skill set, but that's hella lame, so I'm not gonna leave it at that. Now my real unfiltered actual opinion, the weapon that I think is the worst out of these 3 weapons is probably, and kind of unfortunately, the new Wraithclaw. I've been using this weapon a lot since it has been released last Friday, and honestly, like, the major issues with this weapon really hurt. For example, one big one is the lack of range, which is less than the Heroblade and Curved, and of course all other medium weapons. Having only 6 range makes it really hard to catch people, and it's kind of a reason you don't see a lot of people run light weapon with Gale. Besides that, like I said, the crits are also really hard to use effectively, and it's really not a common thing to get a lot of usage out of them, so that really sucks as well. And besides that, I also think the fact that it does slash damage instead of blunt damage like the other fist weapons is also another downside to this weapon, so that is also another issue. All of these factors combined really suck with this weapon, and I hope that they do give it some buffs, and that is why this weapon I think is the worst out of the 3. Now my second best weapon out of the 3 is a little bit controversial, but I would say that is the Heroblade of Winds. Now there are several differences between the Heroblade of Winds and the Curved Blade of Winds, but the reason I put the Heroblade below is mainly because of its swing speed. Like I mentioned earlier, swing speed is really strong right now, so in my opinion because of that, the faster swing speeds with the Curved Blade of Wind are really helpful over the Heroblade, and enough so to put it above the Heroblade. Now besides that, the Heroblade's crit is really bad as well in my opinion, and it's super hard to use effectively, while the Curved on the other hand actually does have some useful crits. So that is another shortcoming of the Heroblade of Winds, and those main reasons are why the Heroblade of Winds I think is worse than the Curved right now, and consequently the Curved Blade of Winds is the best out of those 3 weapons right now. The Curved Blade of Winds has a pretty solid swing speed and also some nice crits as well, which really help the weapon. Not only that, but there's also some other benefits, such as having aftercut innate, which is pretty nice, just saves you a talent, having solid range as a medium weapon, and more, so that's why I think the Curved Blade of Winds is the best out of the 3 weapons. Now all of that being said, there's one more thing that I'd like to add that I think is pretty important when talking about these weapons. My honest opinion is that all of these weapons are really not great at all with the meta. They're pretty bad in my opinion right now actually. Now I know that could be another controversial statement, but let me explain why I think that is. Now outside of top time with top players, I think these weapons are all actually pretty good, and being able to save stat points by going to elemental weapons is super helpful. However, the better players you fight against, the more the weaknesses of these weapons begin to show. Now one major issue with Gale is that Gale is super weak against people who just hold block. Since everyone is running super high posture these days, you can just block every Gale mantra easily and just escape pressure, and that's what a lot of top players are doing and relying on, which is not a bad strategy honestly, but that's a major issue that Gale has. So to make up for this, a lot of top players have been running medium weapons that have high chip or posture damage in order to make up for that lack of pressure on block. However, the problem with all of these elemental weapons for Gale is that none of them have enough posture damage or enough chip, which means that your opponent can easily block these weapons without having much issue. That combined with having Gale, which is also really bad against block right now, makes it really hard to use these elemental weapons against the best players right now, which is why I don't think these elemental weapons are super great right now, at least against top players, which is what I'm basing this off of. So I just thought that was something important to know about these weapons, so take that as you may. Anyway, that was my full and honest opinion about how these Gale elemental weapons compare with each other. Thanks for watching, and like and subscribe for more top content. See you in the next one.